Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the Voice of Reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Today, we're starting out, as we started yesterday, within the vicinity of Bakhmut. We continue to see the noose tightened by Russian forces around Bakhmut. We also continue to hear about the possibility of a Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russian forces. Now, the question has to be asked, if we're looking at a possible Ukrainian counteroffensive, and Bakhmut is obviously so important to the Ukrainians to maintain control over, it's using an immense amount of resources, troops, and assets to try to maintain control of Bakhmut, then the question is why wouldn't the offensive operation take place someplace near Bakhmut? Why wouldn't we see an operation, a counter-operation by the Ukrainians to relieve Bakhmut, to push back Russian forces within the vicinity of Bakhmut? Difficult to say, difficult to ascertain at this point. And I have to question the war goals and war aims of Ukrainian forces. Obviously, the Ukrainians, had a very significant victory that took place within the vicinity of Kharkov. All this area in green here was once controlled by the Russians. It's now controlled by the Ukrainians. Now, at the same time, we do know that operation was very costly for the Ukrainians, much like the operation that took place in the area near Kherson on the western bank of the Dnieper River. But specifically, Bakhmut. Why Bakhmut? Why is Bakhmut so important for the Ukrainians to hold on to? Even Pentagon officials, NATO states, have said to the Ukrainians, look, we're not sure this is worth what is happening. And what is happening is the loss of lives, the loss of troops, but it seems to be a test of wills at this point. And it's both a test of media wills, it's a test of military wills at the same time. And could operations by the Ukrainians that are continuing in Bakhmut, we know there's we'll transition over to the a brigade level where you can kind of see what units the Ukrainians have in this area. But again, a very, very costly endeavor indeed for the Ukrainians. And again, I have to question the military goals of keeping Bakhmut. Did they fall into a Russian trap? Was this something that the Ukrainians walked into? And look, yes, the Russians are suffering casualties, but at the same time, the Ukrainians are suffering casualties as well. And this is not a war of maneuver. They are playing into the hands of Russian forces. And what I mean by that is they are on the receiving end of great amounts of heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket fire against Ukrainian positions that run around Bakhmut to the north and to the south of Bakhmut as well. And if we look at how the situation has played out, we've not seen any pushback from the Ukrainians. You can tell this is very much a static war by the Ukrainians, and again, this noose continues to tighten. So let's look at what has happened over the course of the last several days. We're going to go back to, say, March 20th. And then let's watch, again, slowly what has happened. And this is an intent-based mission by the Russians in terms of what they're trying to do in this area. And here we go. And you can see that orange converging towards the city center of Bakhmut. You can see the envelopment operation continuing. And then you can finally see up in the last 24 hours the city center now, Russian Wagner forces, Russian VDV forces to the south, continuing this pressure campaign against Ukrainian forces. And if we'll go one more day, and you can see again, several city blocks have fallen. Again, back once. We'll zoom in, And this is a fairly large area that was fortified by Ukrainian forces. Look, you have the river here. You have the main road into the city. How do you pronounce that? Or Horbatova Street? Gorbatova Street? And then we'll go one day ahead. One day back, one day ahead. So again, a large area that was taken by Russian forces. Now, is this a great maneuver operation? No, but when you look at it within the confines of small infantry tactics, this whole area along this riverbank was fortified by the Ukrainians. All these buildings were turned into defensive redoubts. And again, this is a Ukrainian site that's reporting this. And we're going back 2 days now. We're going 48 hours. And look at the area that was taken. This area. And then finally this area. And you have multiple city blocks that were taken with some fairly large buildings as well. And if we go over and we look at the brigade deployment of Ukrainian forces, again, sizable contingent of Ukrainian forces that are deployed in the Bakhmut area of operations. Again, you've got the larger unit, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. Again, you have elements of the 77th Air Mobile Brigade. You have the 3rd Operational Brigade of the Ukrainian National Guard. You have Special Operations Regiment. You have a number of territorial brigades, Special Operations Battalions, the 5th Assault Brigade. Again, this is a new unit of the Ukrainian military. This was recently formed out of elements of the Ukrainian National Guard. These are new units that have been trained by NATO forces and are now being deployed in this area. And again, you have to wonder, would this unit, and we've even heard Ukrainian leadership talk about these new National Guard assault brigades that are being formed would be used in the reconquest of territory taken by the Russians. But obviously, this new brigade is being used in a static deployment very close to Bakhmut, just to the southwest of Bakhmut. And again, you have to wonder the feasibility of Ukrainian forces to get out of Bakhmut. And again, I have to wonder if it's not so much of a matter of the Ukrainians wanting to keep Bakhmut, is they just can't get out of Bakhmut right now. And that could pose a significant problem for these forces that are trying to continue to defend Bakhmut. And you have to ask again, well, did the Ukrainians wait too long? Were the Ukrainians trying to hold Bakhmut, trying to hold down the Russians, hold off the Russians, and it didn't work? And now it's very, very difficult for the Ukrainian forces to simply work their way out of Bakhmut. And I think that's more of a likelihood than this is a designed operation to continue to defend Bakhmut. And again, if you look at these new units that are being deployed, such as the 5th Assault Brigade that has been deployed forward, again, you have to ask that same question. Were these units designated for other offensive operations around the country? And in all likelihood, we probably won't see a counteroffensive by Ukrainian forces. I know it's continuing to be talked about, but again, we're just not seeing the capability that could be present for Ukrainian forces to launch such an endeavor. I think the Ukrainians are still a ways off in terms of receiving enough equipment from the West, receiving enough training from the West. There are still thousands of Ukrainian troops in Western countries, United Kingdom and other countries as well, still undergoing training. So then I think the question is this a defense of Bakhmut and the defense of Eastern Donbass? This is just a let's try and hold the Russians off while we can, and then possibly let's look till another time period to try and launch a successful operation, maybe in the area near Zaporizhia. We continue to hear about this talk, especially by content providers that state that the ultimate goal is to cut the land corridor from Russia proper to Crimea. Well, difficult to say at this point. I think that likelihood, based on what we're seeing on the ground right now, is very remote. I would have to say remove the possibility from your train of thought that the Ukrainians are going to launch this massive counteroffensive and cut the land corridor to the Crimea. I don't see that capability right now. Now, will that capability exist in the future? Difficult to say, but I also anticipate the Russians launching something of of greater importance come late summer or maybe midsummer as the weather starts to change and dry things up. I don't think either side is in a position for large-scale offensive operations, given what's happening with the terrain right now, the rain, the saturation. And I don't see that. I can see this continued static warfare going on with these small encirclement operations by Russian forces against Ukrainian forces. And again, I know that the Ukrainians are reporting that they're causing a lot of casualties within Russian forces near Bakhmut. But you also have to wonder about the size and the scope of Russian artillery operations, missile operations, cruise missiles, Iskander missiles, aircraft operations against Ukrainian targets are also taking a significant toll on the Ukrainians. And I'm not sure that the Ukrainians, at the end of the day, is what they're doing in Bakhmut going to serve their best interests, or is this going to degrade their armed forces? That's the question right now. Because the Russians have access to more personnel, and more importantly, they have a much greater military-industrial complex that is not being struck by Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian military-industrial complex has been greatly degraded and destroyed by Russian cruise missile strikes and airstrikes and what have you. That's not happening with the Russians. The Russians are still continuing to expand its military-industrial complex, catch up to the current situation on the ground, which is essentially an all-out war. And that inherently benefits the Russians, especially when you look at this as a long-term conflict, a conflict that's going to last another 1 to 2 years. So again, does not bode well for the Ukrainians. Now, if we were seeing some sort of maneuver operations by the Ukrainians, if we were seeing renewed operations, the likes which we saw in Kharkov, that may change the dynamic a bit. And if we do see that, if we do see something in the south where the Ukrainians are able to push the Russians back, envelop Russian forces, then that would change my perception of the ongoing conflict, and I would have to reevaluate what I'm seeing on the ground. But we're not seeing that. We're seeing this static conflict with the use, with still a lot of use of heavy artillery, rockets, attack aircraft hitting Ukrainian targets on the ground. And again, the Ukrainians are being tight-lipped about their casualties. They're taking a lot of casualties. They're just not talking about it. They can't talk about it for morale purposes. They're probably hiding stuff from their political leadership as well. So, again, difficult to say what's going on the ground. But as you look at this Ukrainian supplied site, again, if you really have 10 brigades in this area defending it, this does not look good. I'm just saying. I mean, the Ukrainians could say, oh, we're bleeding the Russians. That's our intent. Well, are you? Hard to say. So we'll continue to cover the ongoing war. We'll continue to cover what is happening near Bakhmut. Thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.